My name is Charles Lawrence, and this is my 29th year to be coming to Finland. Finland became a part of my history, my destiny years ago, when I was accompanying a traditional Hopi grandmother who had become my mother, adopted me, Carolyn Twanyama, a traditional Hopi from Third Mesa, Haute Villa in Arizona. And I had become grandmother's companion over the years, had been sent to her at a time in her life that was obviously very meaningful to her. To me, I was following the guidance that an elder had said to me after a ceremony up in Sacramento, California, that while I was leading this group of about 1,000 people moving around in a big dance formation in this space, and I had been given my first big eagle feather. And after it was all over, this old man, elder, tapped me on the shoulder, and at first his message was startling to me because my life had been so radically shifted. When I was 40, I left the business world, the usual social world of New York City, and I found myself going what is now called the Red Road, the pathway of the heart. And I've been traveling for a while with a very well-known educator, and we were doing these gatherings to discover more and more what happens when people come together of like mind and like heart. So this elder had said to me that he wanted me to know that eagle feather was proud to have me being its carrier at that moment in time. As I said, that was new. And then he said to me, and while you were doing that, he said, I had a vision, and there's an old woman down on the Hopi reservation that you're supposed to go meet. He had heard her name. He didn't know her, but he heard her name. And he described the house where she lived, down a dirt road, And I was astounded. Already other seemingly bizarre and yet fortuitous incidents has happened. And I listen to what the guidance is, and I will follow through to the best of my ability. So I would say maybe 4 months later, we already had a big dance on the south at the Grand Canyon in Utah, in the Canyonlands. And I drove with my partner down to Hopi land. And initially, I never had any interest to go to Hopi. But here I find myself going to Hopi, got lost in a blizzard, and on Hopi land, there are dirt roads here and there, and I saw one or two of the road symbols this man told me, and I turned down a certain road, and because it was snowing so heavily, there was no one around, except eventually I saw what I later described as a little bundle of blankets out by a wood pile chopping wood. And I stopped the car, and I got out and I asked this woman, it turned out to be a woman, could she point me to the house of, I couldn't say Twanyama as I say it today, but point me to the house of Carolyn Twanyama. And she said to me in a rather sharp voice, what do you want her for? And my response was, I was told to come to meet her. And this little lady said, well, you're looking at her. And she passed me the axe. And in that Zen way, I started chopping wood with the fire inside the house. And that was the beginning of what was about a 20-year relationship with this extraordinary elder who had a mission with her people, part of which was to have the Hopi prophecy be finally told at the UN, a prophecy that goes back 800 years, when they were told that there would be crises in the world, there would be wars in the world, and then a gourd of ashes would be dropped from the sky, and that would be the sign that destruction was near at hand. And of course, this gourd of ashes was the first atomic bomb dropped over Japan by the US government. And at that time, that activated the Hopi, because this tradition of this prophecy had been passed down for generation upon generation. And they had been guided, instructed is a better word to use, to go to the man in the White House. Now, who knew 800 years before there'd be a White House in Washington, D.C.? And they were to knock on the door of that White House and ask to be allowed to come in, be invited in, that they had some words of caution to offer. And they had, by the time I arrived, they had indeed done that and had not been acknowledged, they had been turned away. And in that prophecy, they also had been told, if the man in the White House does not invite you in, then you are to go to the house of Micah, where the leaders of the world would be gathering. Now, who knew 800 years ago there would be a UN building in New York City that the windows all looked like mica schist when the sun of the afternoon sun is shining on them? But indeed, that was the house of Micah. And where I had come along at that point, they had gone the third time, and they were then to tell the leaders of the world, please let us in. We have something important to share with you. And they had been refused all those times. Now, those previous attempts. So I was plunged into a world that was totally startling to me at that time. I had begun to spend a month or two at a time on the reservation, and I would be there sometimes for the planting of the beans at the right time in May, or I'd be there in October to help harvest the corn, the beans, the squashes. And I'd become a part of the Hopi way. I had met many elders. I had been down in the kivas for ceremonies. I had been present for some of their wonderful kasina dances when they danced for rain and they called for rain for their crops. And was becoming very, I think I find out later, very accepted by them. They were watching me. What was I going to do? How was I going to be of service to them? So when I heard all these things, I could feel the frustration, the alarm, because these elders were getting old at that time. And it was sometime after that visit to New York when I joined them for the first time, and I was out on the reservation in northern Arizona, and Kahuna from Hawaii arrived with some of his students, and an Aboriginal grandmother from Australia had been sent to the UN, but she had been told then by her elders in Australia that she was to find the grandmother. Well, Hopi land is a long way from New York City, but she got off the airplane and she was more interested in finding grandmother than she was going to the UN. And of course, it just happened so-called synchronistically that one of the women greeting her had also become acquainted to Grandmother Carolyn through me. There's a wisdom teaching amongst the native people, and especially among the Hopi and those desert people, of iktomi. Iktomi is a giant spider that weaves the spider web of life that creates connections. And we never know just specifically when the next connection is going to open. So that particular day, I'd driven down to Hopi. Grandmother wanted me to be there. I flew into Flagstaff, rented a car. And we're all sitting around in Grandmother's house, and the elders. Little Dan was about 100 at that time, and Titus maybe 91, 92. The elders were all there talking with the kahuna and his students, the Aboriginal grandmother. And I was hearing these stories that were inflaming to me. It really agitated me, because I knew the elders were doing their best to have their story, their mission, the prophecy told at the UN. So at one point I got so frustrated, I got in my car and I drove over between the second and third mesa on Hopi land is a place called Prophecy Rock. And there's a petroglyph carved into the rock out there that's hundreds and hundreds of years old. But it described the world wars, and they knew ancient time ago, they knew there were going to be these two world wars. And there was going to be the time of another war, impending war, that would create the greatest devastation ever. And the elders were doing the best they could to prevent that third war from happening. So here am I, this guy sent by this gentleman, find the grandmother. And I got by that time I was a pipe carrier. I've been inducted into carrying a ceremonial pipe. And I filled my pipe and I was praying to creation, to the Hopi. There is their creator, their instructor is called Masao. And I had heard these stories, so I had a perception of Masao. And I found myself crying because I began to realize how I loved these people because of their innocence, their openness to me. And I said to the creator, I said, look, I'm not a Hopi, but I love these people so much. They're getting old, they're getting weak. Some of them have died already. And if there's anything I can do that before they're all gone, that prophecy is told at the UN. Please let me help. I walked away. Time went on. More elders died. I got somewhat frustrated. But what could I do? I'm just this white brother from another place. 5 years, almost 5 years to the date, went by. And one morning I was visiting out on Hopi land, and I had taken a dear friend from New York with me who loved grandmother and had gotten to know the elders. And we were sitting in the home of Thomas Banyakia in Second Mesa, Kakotspedi. And he was telling me that they had gone to the UN for the last time. And at that time I was at another reservation in Idaho. I'd been called out for some medicine gatherings. And I got so excited because they'd been refused again. And I thought, something's got to happen. So I grabbed my friend, and this is 1991, I believe it is. I grabbed her, and we drove directly to Flagstaff, about 125 miles away. And the first gas station I could find that had a pay telephone was working. I only knew one woman who was an NGO at the UN. I called her. She was sitting at her desk. Amazing, because that's not the usual story. I hung up from her, and I found later that she had immediately called the wife of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who was then the director of the UN, and she was home. And after 50 years of the Hopi making this effort, within 6 months, they were on the agenda at the UN. And they had that opportunity to tell the story, to warn the people, to invite the UN to come to Hopi, hear this story. Those were very powerful times for me. Realizing that I had become a part of another people's story. What didn't happen was that the UN did not come out. The US government blocked them from coming out. They didn't want the UN to hear these stories, these warnings. So then, gradually, all the elders died. And yet I knew that I'd done the best I could to help them fulfill that mandate. And then I would go back and forth. Once the elders started dying, especially when grandmother passed on, I was really sad. My heart was broken because I loved these people so much. And I was out visiting one time. I'd gone out with some friends from Denmark. We had gone to make a documentary. It's called The Fifth Gate. And the grandson of one of the famous uncles or grandfathers, he was my best friend at that time. And he appeared in that documentary. And a few years went by, and I was out there one day, and he said to me one night, he said, "Charles, tomorrow morning, I want you out there on the edge of the mesa when the sun comes up. I want you naked. I want you to be out there to see the sun." And that's when he baptized me as a Hopi. I was given my Hopi name. And what Manuel Hoyungwa said to me was that you have proven yourself over all these years. Because the Hopi take a long time. They watch your movements. What are your motives? What are you doing? Do you have a secret agenda? And I can say to you, that you are listening, all I knew in my heart that I had fallen in love with these people. And I would do anything I could to help them. So that's a bit of a story there about Hopi land. I became grandmother's companion. That's how I ended up in Finland in 1989. Raisa Gorbachev was co-sponsoring a gathering in the USSR, the beginning of Perestroika, for the Grandmothers for Peace. And Carolyn had been an advocate globally for the indigenous people of the world to come to the UN and the UN Human Rights Subcommittees meetings. And those were exciting times to be with Carolyn. I went to Geneva a couple times with her, and I became her traveling companion. In fact, she wouldn't travel without me at that point. I carried her suitcases, etc. But anyhow, we landed in Finland at that time because no American airlines were flying into Soviet airspace. And we had to transfer to Aeroflot. And that began my relationship with Finland. After a month in Russia, we came back and stayed a few days. Grandmother, I think, was 89 at that time, about that age, and she was tired. We had gone to many, many sites in USSR, had some wonderful experiences, but that little body was tired. So we were here, met some wonderful people, and then I flew her back home, back to Hopi. And that was my beginning, my entryway to Finland. Teemu Kasela had known grandmother before I knew her. He'd been to Hopi. Began to meet the elders. He was on his own mission, discovery, for himself. I thought I was sent there to help them, but I was also learning a lot and having my perceptions expanded by learning the way of the native people. So Teemu then invited me to come back a couple of times for different gatherings. I brought a native couple one time to Joensuu for one of the big midsummer concerts up there. I think with David Byrne was there. He was the headliner at that time. And we brought some of our music to Finland. And then I came here because I was also been working with other traditions with recovery programs. And then I started coming back and doing some workshops. And these folks were gathering, friends of Teemu. People were interested in awakening folks to the old shamanistic traditions. Well, that was very exciting to me. And we then gave birth in 1996 to the Four Winds. A ceremonial community. It's a family because families have always been part of my vision. The children, the parents, the grandparents, we all come together as family as was done in the old times. So we've just completed our 22nd year of the Four Winds here now. A marvelous gathering. We had Korean shaman and her troop was here. Dear Swami from India came for the third time. Mona Palaka, who's one of the 13 grandmothers, Hopi Dewa Havasupai, was here with her friend doing teachings. And this community has continued to grow here in Finland. And I'm very proud to say that I'm the grandpa. I'm the one who stayed with the community, the friendships, the love that exists, and the trust. I'm proud of. I sit here and say I'm very proud of our community and how it's serving the people. Many, many stories I can tell of these years here. What happened with the native elders in America. A mission I was sent on to South Africa. And I just received a notice today from South Africa that a Sangoma that I was sent to in 2001 with a spearhead, a jasper spearhead from the Blackfoot country of Wyoming. He's 97 now. But I, again, was privileged by this voice that said, do this, do that. And I ended up taking him a weapon in his language. He had been crying for 10 years for a weapon to fight AIDS in Africa. And for some reason, this guy, me, I was selected to be the carrier of that weapon. Astounding. For some people who've heard some of these stories, it rather boggles their imagination. How can these things come to be? Well, to me, part of this is really having an open heart and a willingness to go beyond what is out there in life. What does life have for us? How can we serve life in some way? And then just wait and see what happens. One of the stories I'd like to share also is concerning a Sami man, Mattis Penta, his name. In 1996, we had our first gathering. Tamu had invited people 4 directions. I believe at that one we had one from Africa. I forget who came from the east, but the Sami came. And I did not know this at the time, but at that point, over 150 years ago or more, Mattis's great-grandfather had been beheaded by the crown of Norway. And what it was, that the people, they were instructed to give the Sami people money or food for their reindeer pelts and the reindeer meat. And as the story goes, someone who was in cahoots with a Lutheran minister or someone like that was giving them alcohol instead of what they needed. And of course, that alcohol has been used in America to crush the spirit of the native people. It's been used around the world that same way. Well, Mattis tells a story, or told, he crossed on a few years ago. But when they had a huge drum at that time for the Four Winds. And when I brought the shoulder, boom, the mallet down on the drum, boom, to open the gate of Four Winds, he saw a flash of lightning at that moment. And he heard my voice, again, the voice of intuition, or how we want to name that. But he said he heard my voice say, the skull is coming home. I knew nothing at that moment about the skull, not a thing. And what happened that after all these years of hunting, and the family had been in shame because of their traditions, if a body is not complete when it's buried, something is off. And after years and years of hunting, and I believe Mattis's mother was in her 90s at that time, but she knew, she had this intuition that before she died, the skull would come home. Well, magic, miracles. 4 months later, on a shelf in the medical university at Copenhagen, the skull was found with a tag on it. And there was a time years ago when they believed if you had a big skull, you had a big brain and you were smart. Bizarre thinking, but that's what they did then. So it led to a revival maybe of the spirit of that family. And there's a documentary, which just now I'm going to be receiving a copy of, that Mattis and others made, where he made a canoe and they traveled to Copenhagen and then brought the skull back to Sami land. And this was up in the Kautokeino area. And after the premiere of The Fifth Gate in Copenhagen in 2000, I flew up there. And over the years, had gotten to know Mattis and things that happened after that. But I took the pipe and went to the place where that skull had been buried. And some awful things have been done to Native people around the world. To me, they're unconscionable. How these, especially the Christian people, what the madness inside of Christianity, well, it still goes on. But how they had humiliated the people, what they had done to their spirits over the years, is a very dark shadow on Christianity, in my point of view. But anyhow, no one remembered where the body was buried. It could not be buried in a churchyard over the years ago because the family was in disgrace. But I went to this place with this family, all these relations, Mattis's sister, the nephews, the nieces, and we stood there that day, and all these things happened that were amazing. It snowed. It rained a little bit. The sun shone down on us. And at the last moment, about 12 birds landed on a branch just above our heads and began to sing. This chorus of birds. Well, to the Sami people, that gave them such peace. As I tell you this story, I feel tears in my eyes. I was destined to play a part in their family story. We are all storytellers. And among the Native people back home, there is a tradition of telling what they call the good medicine story. The story that might inspire somebody else. The story that almost seems impossible. How did these things happen? But to us, spirit is, you just can't question spirit. I cannot question creation. All I can do is play my part, show up, have a willingness, and see what happens. So maybe these little stories I've shared a little bit here will touch someone who's listening. And that's my responsibility now as I get older and older, to tell the stories of what happened.